Thank you very, very much. Our next presenter, talking about agriculture profits, who gets them and who will in the future. Dr. Bill Heffernan has written more than 100 papers, articles, and book chapters on the changing nature of agriculture and food system. He's given presentations in more than 30 states, in Canada, in Japan, and in Europe. You know, there's a lot of pseudo-scientific bodies in America. There's a lot of fake scientific bodies that are only put together for media publication or media use, or to use the media. But he served on the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Alternative Agriculture. The National Academy of Sciences has never been attacked by anybody of any persuasion of being anything other than a very legitimate, serious scientific group. He was the first recipient of Rural Sociological Society's Award for Excellence in Extension and Public Service. He comes to us as a professor of rural psychology from the University of Missouri. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bill Heffernan. Dr. Heffernan.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate very much the opportunity to be with you. This is really a very interesting topic. There are various perspectives on the issue. It sort of reminds me a little bit of the old fable about the three blind men trying to describe an elephant by touching it. One's perception of the beast depends on where one stands. And in a sense, as we discuss this topic today, all day long, we're going to find again that the different speakers up here see it a bit differently depending on where we're at. In a sense, the debate we have, or the discussion we have today is really sort of a debate about values. It's not that we don't all have an interest in all these issues, the broad spectrum of issues. It's the fact that we put different priorities on some of these kinds of issues. And so we need to realize that we are talking about, and different speakers will emphasize different things. I will emphasize different things, for instance, than our two previous speakers have. An old sociologist one time said the best way to find out what people value is to see what they get emotional about. And I think the conference we have here will probably back that up pretty well. So I want to talk about the food system. Really, and both previous speakers have talked about the fact if we want to understand the beef industry, we have to look beyond just the beef industry. One of the things you need to realize, the food system is not becoming different than other sectors of the economy. It's becoming more like the other sectors. And keep that in mind as I talk about what's happening nationally and internationally. The other point I would make, though, is that as I come to the end of my remarks when I talk about where's the hope for the future, one of the interesting things about food is that it is different than all other things that sell on the market because it's a necessity and it's needed on a regular basis. And that gives us the potential of bringing public interest back to that whole area a bit. Now, you should have your 4-page tables here, or 2 pages. Pull those out, if you will, for a moment, please. You notice I pulled mine out of the pocket. I want you, when you leave here today, to fold it in half, fold it in thirds, put it in your shirt pocket, and take it with you when you go to the sale barns, to the coffee shop, wherever you meet with other people. Be sure and take this along with you. You can have lots of fun and lots of discussions. At the university, we would call those seminars. We have other names for them, of course, out in the country. You have other names for what professors do, too. But anyway, be that as it may. Let me start down through this. First of all, let me tell you exactly where I come from. Mr. Peterson did an excellent job of sort of laying out the position from his point of view. He is hired to be the CEO of IBP, and he makes his decisions accordingly. It's as if he sat down to play the game of Monopoly, and he was told, you cannot change the rules of the game. And so within the rules of the game, Mr. Peterson laid out sort of his perspective. I have no argument with that. But I'm paid by public taxpayers. I feed at the public trough, and I'm asked to do research to look at some of the public issues. And I start with the assumption we can change the rules of the game, okay? So understand where we're coming from. My position is that the restructuring now going on in the food system is not inevitable. It was not ordained by God. It is being put in place by men, and therefore we can change it. The idea of the invisible hand in the marketplace basically went out as the competition left the marketplace. Today, the hand or the hands in the marketplace, in the food sector, are becoming very visible. Last week, Alan Greenspan spoke of irrational exuberance in the stock market, and his words sent tremors around the world. All that says is the economic system is constructed and shaped by man, and it's not something that's inevitable out there. So let me now turn to the tables that you have in front of you, and I want to just quickly highlight a couple of things that you can read for yourself. But notice first of all that a few firms in each of the commodities basically have 4% or more of the market. Mr. Peterson raised an interesting question. What's the issue on concentration? The real interesting issue on concentration is when you get 1, 2, 3, 4, or maybe 5 firms that control a particular market. So it's not concentration all the way back. It's not a matter where we drop from 100 to 50 necessarily. The real issue, as he properly points out, is the issue of when we get down to that 3 or 4. Economists use game theory to explain this. Social psychologists use what we call small group theory. The point is this. They can put individuals in rooms so they're isolated, they can't visit with one another, they give them a problem to solve, and then they watch how these people react, and they change their behavior based on what the other 2, 3, 4 people do. And that's what's happened in the markets when we have 4 firms with 40% of the market. That in a sense, they began to respond, they watch one another's behavior. When there's only 2 or 3 or 4 firms, each of those know that they can affect the market by what they do, by buying, selling, or where they set their price. One person does it because he knows it can influence the price. The other ones usually follow suit. And so when the price of beef cattle a few years ago went to 80 cents, one of the packing companies pulled their buyers out that day. The other 2 followed suit, sent their people off to coffee, and guess what? The next day the price of beef was down below 80 cents. 2 years ago, I raised soybeans, live on a farm. We watched the same thing happen in soybeans when soybeans got up to 7 cents a bushel. The point is, when you have 4 firms or fewer, they can very much influence the market. And that's the real issue. And that's when concentration really becomes the major issue. Second thing you will notice as you look through those tables is it tends to be the same firms in each of the commodities. Now, if we were to have had someone from ConAgra or Cargill here this morning, they'd have given us a bit of a different presentation than what Mr. Peterson gave. And the reason why is, as you look down through those lists, you see that they're in lots of different commodities. IBP is basically in the slaughtering of beef and pork, and that's it. They do not have any of their own feedlots like the other 2 firms do. They're not as vertically integrated, which brings on the third point that I want to make, and that is, my students call this formalized from seed to shelf. We usually call it vertical integration. I have here the annual report of ConAgra. They say they're the largest distributor of ag chemicals in North America. They're one of the largest fertilizer producers. They have their own seed. They own 100 elevators, both terminal and local elevators. They move their inputs out to the farmers. In the wheat area, for example, the farmers buy those commodities at the local elevator. They produce the crop. They take it back to that elevator. There are 3 firms today that mill 90% of all the flour in North America. ConAgra is the largest. They're into livestock feed. You'll see on your form there, they are the 4th largest broiler producer in the country. They moved down this year from 2nd place to 4th place. I want to come back to that. They have their own slaughtering of their birds. Of course, they hire growers to raise their birds Incidentally, there are really only 40 chicken farmers in the whole country today, in case you didn't know who the chicken farmers were. There are lots of growers, but there's only 40 chicken farmers. They always own that product all the way through. You can buy that as a country skillet whole fryer, or you can buy it as a Beatrice pot pie or a banquet TV dinner. That's ConAgra all the way. Here's their annual report of a few years back. Shows you some of the products that they produce. And the list goes on. This was the back side of this. And you can see where it's a seed to shelf business. Now this is where IBP, of course, is different. IBP isn't forward and backwardly integrated. Incidentally, about 6 cents of your food dollar goes to ConAgra, just to give you some idea of the importance that they play at the consumer level. The largest, of course, being Philip Morris, and you spend about a dime with Philip Morris out of your food dollar each year. The point I really want to make here is these firms have what we call deep pockets. And by that I mean when they're in the various commodities you see, when they're in the whole sector from the input side of it all the way through to the output side, or to the very product that goes to the supermarket shelf. And in fact, as Mr. Peterson pointed out, there is a bit of competition between the food companies and the supermarkets, and that gets negotiated in rather interesting ways, but we don't have time to talk about that this morning. But Iowa Beef is in an interesting position because they do not have their own feedlots, and thus they got involved in doing more of the forward contracting. But by the same token, they don't follow it all the way through the food chain as much either. And so what that means is, and since they're not in other commodities, firms like ConAgra and Cargill can lose money in one area, but as long as they're making money somewhere else, no problem. Here just gives you an idea of Cargill's different things that they're in. That's just a partial list of them. So the point is, they could lose money in the beef packing industry for 2 or 3 years. No problem as long as they're making money in other sectors. In that sense, and I know it seems a little strange, and I really didn't come here to try to generate a lot of sympathy for Mr. Peterson this morning, but the fact is Iowa Beef in the food industry is really quite small. They are somewhere between where the producers are and these other firms, and thus some of his remarks this morning revealed that, and very rightly so. And we need to understand that in the marketplace today, whether we're talking about national, I want to go global in just a minute, the size and scale and basically what we call the deep pockets becomes a very important issue. And it's at that point that efficiency no longer becomes so important. That's really economic power. And we could talk about a lot of consequences of that. One of them that I want to talk about is the whole issue of what difference it makes to our families and rural communities when we have family businesses, be that ranches, farms, elevators, mom and pop grocery stores, or whether we have corporations. And I want to focus the issue on who provides the labor, management, and capital. When we have a family business, defined as a business in which most of the labor, management, and capital, or at least a significant portion, is provided by that family. At the end of the year, when they subtract their expenses from their sales, we hope it's a plus, we call it a profit, but in fact, economists call that return to management, labor, and capital. As long as that family lives in that local rural community, which if they're providing a significant portion of the labor, they basically have to, then all that profit gets respent back in that local community. When a corporation comes in and owns the feedlots, or in the case of broiler growers, the whole system, basically, if you will, when a corporation comes in, they see labor as another input. And they try to buy that labor as cheaply as possible. And that stays in that local community. Then what we call profits is called return to management and labor or capital, and it leaves the community immediately. Goes back to corporate headquarters, or as I'm going to try to argue here in a moment, basically probably goes to other parts of the world to be invested in some kind of oftentimes a food system situation. The point is, when corporations come in, the return, the profits, the economic base of our rural community is just cut precipitously. Think for a moment with me, what has traditionally been the difference between agriculturally based rural communities in this country and mining and lumber-based rural communities? Think of the Appalachia, where they had coal, a tremendous resource. Needed coal. It was great demand, but it was the corporations that came in. They hired the labor as cheaply as possible. We've never known, the Appalachia area has never known prosperity because all the economic benefits were siphoned out of that rural community. And folks, what's happening as we move toward increased industrialization and the corporate takeover of agriculture, we see the same things happening in our rural communities. A second point I would make, simply as a part of this industrialized model, is that as we separate management and labor, management is there to do the thinking. And as John just wound up his comments talking about the individual who spends so much time learning the trade and so on, the whole role in the food sector, as of course other industry, is to de-skill the labor. We did it quite successfully in the processing. And of course, the thing that really started the whole ball rolling on the restructuring of the processing part of it and the de-skilling was, of course, the box beef concept. And the way that Iowa beef came in to really take over the dominant position in beef cattle, some would argue, those who defend the system would argue that was really an innovation and modernization. Others argue, no, that was really just a matter to really de-skill the labor, to drop the wages that go to labor by better than 50%. And of course, the communities that have these processing plants really felt the impact. Many of you probably have seen the recent book that came out that talks about the processing plant called Any Way You Cut It. It's written by anthropologists. You heard reference to them this morning. But again, this book doesn't look just at the beef industry. It looks at the beef, the pork, the poultry, and the seafood industry. The same thing happened in all of them. It's just in the case of beef, Iowa beef happened to get in the forefront of that one. But in a sense, what it means is we de-skill the worker. Management class does the thinking. The view is basically, and this goes back to the old Taylor scientific management, if workers are thinking, they're not working enough. As again, reference to John's comments a moment ago, when we de-skill agriculture, we are giving up here, Australia, many of the other developed nations of the world, one of our, what I would call our major relative advantages. That is, what we have are those skilled managers, the best the world has ever seen. And in a sense, the whole movement toward industrialization is to move away from that, to make our beef producers basically like the poultry growers. Our poultry growers today are basically nothing other than hired workers, and except the fact they have to put up some of their own capital to make things operate. In fact, the growers put up about half the capital in the industry. Okay, now I want to go global with you for just a moment. Perhaps that's where the greater excitement is happening right now. And so let me again start with Cargill. When we're talking about deep pocket, or the term sometimes cross-subsidization, they have the benefit over Iowa beef, not only because they're in a whole variety of commodities, but also they're in something over 60 countries of the world. ConAgra, I think, is in 32 countries of the world. When they begin to move around the world, then the issues began to change rather significantly. Let me first of all, I want you just to think a moment about this issue here. There used to be a great disagreement on the saying, what's good for General Motors is good for the United States, and we used to argue about that. And when it was a domestic company, I think we had reasons to debate that. What I want to really show today is that now that they operate in 60 countries of the world, they don't have allegiance to any country of the world. And that's the point I want to make. And in a sense, I think that's not much of a debate anymore on this issue. In fact, it's pretty clear that what's best for Cargill may not be what's best for the United States. We need to remember that both capital and technology are mobile. When Cargill went over to Thailand to set up their poultry operations, they took the genetic stock, they took the nutritional information, they took the building designs and even the contract. Basically, they took the whole poultry system that we saw in this country, in which they were involved. They were in the top 20. And they laid it down in Thailand, and the CP group, which was a local group, came to Arbor Acres to get the genetic stock, forming a joint venture. They came to Continental Grain, which ships 25% of the grain in the world. Incidentally, Cargill ships 25% of the grain in the world also, to get the nutritional information and such. Those two firms, in a matter of about 10 to 12 years, took Thailand from being basically not a commercial poultry producer at all to ranking 6th as an exporter of poultry in the world. Now, what happens is, and incidentally, I need to add that when they started, people in rural Thailand would work for less than $5 a day. Quite a bit less than our people work for. But now, of course, Thailand being a tiger nation, those people want closer to $8 to $10 a day. And so now both the CP group and Cargill have gone to China, Malaysia, Burma, other countries of the world where people will still work for less than $5 a day. And so, in a sense, when we're looking at the cost of meat production, especially the more environmentally controlled, this does not apply as much to the ranching business, the cow-calf operation. The major issue becomes the cost of feed, the cost of labor. I just said we're a high-cost producer in terms of labor, in terms of transportation, but if you have an environmentally controlled building, like in the case of poultry production, you can set those buildings up right along the coast or wherever you have the transportation system already. And then, of course, government regulations. We are a high-cost producer here because we have a lot of the regulations and so on concerning our environment, health, food safety, and so forth. Many other countries of the world do not insist on those to the same extent we do. I know I'm moving fast, but I need to get through this because you're going to want to quit talking about food and eat it before long. A new word, sourcing. These transnational corporations begin to travel around the world to see where they can source that product the cheapest. And then, like good business people, they get it produced there, and then they sell it to where there's a market. So what is indeed happening? The reality of the world is, and a lot of my ag econ friends and so on talk about the growing population and how many more mouths there are to feed and what a great opportunity this is for farmers. Think about it for a minute, folks. Who will work for the least? The hungriest people, huh? Those people, what, 20% of the world have annual family incomes of less than $200? It's in those countries where they tend to work for the least. Remember now, the capital and technology is mobile. So increasingly, these companies go into these countries, the poorer countries. They produce it there where people work cheaply, and then they send it back into the have nations of the world. A lot of talk today about poultry. 3 years ago, I guess it was, 2 or 3 years ago, I heard Dick Gady, who's chief economist and vice president of ConAgra, say, don't anticipate a big increase in poultry exports from this country in the future. Now, in fact, the last 2 years there has been an increase. I just told you this last year, ConAgra dropped from number 2 to number 4. Cargill, which was somewhere in the top 20 in poultry production, this past year sold their whole poultry operation in the United States to Tyson. They did get, in exchange, in addition to cash, they did get the old Wilson plant there in Marshall, Missouri, which is now a modern hog slaughter facility. You can't help but ask yourself the question, what do these two big transnational corporations know about the future of the broiler industry? And as we talk about, they have pushed. If you had a grower here, they would tell you how badly the growers have been pushed to the wall, how many of them are going bankrupt, how they have to have non-farm jobs to support their operations. They'll tell you how tough it is in the broiler industry. But even at that, folks, it can be done cheaper in other parts of the world. One of my big questions is, when will we start bringing in poultry? When will we begin to lose that broiler operations or production in this country? And we know Tyson, when NAFTA went through, Tyson went down and bought the second largest processing plant in Mexico. In fact, they sold their processing plant up in Quebec Growers up there were all excited about it until they found out that Tyson said, oh, we're not leaving the Canadian market, we're just not going to produce poultry in Canada. You know how that goes. So when we look at the competition about poultry, we got to ask the question on one hand, yeah, how do we compete with it? On the other hand, we got to realize that even as low a price of poultry is in this country now, which they've just squeezed it every cent out of the producer, the fact still remains on the international basis, we may start exporting or importing more and more of that. One other thing that I need to mention on all these firms, especially these large transnational corporations, is they expect to make at least a 20% return on their investment. Now, we can talk about the margins in the food industry and all that you want. Folks, the bottom line is what return you get on your investment. They are making about a 20%. ConAgra, I got their annual report, says they average about 23.5% over the last 5 years. What do you folks get? Well, it's in the red ink in the cattle industry right now, but for an average, talk about 2 or 3%. If you look at a lot of the ag econ data coming out of USDA and such, that's about where it runs. So the point is, and incidentally, I don't want to say that's too much, although I will tell you that the food industry is second only to the pharmaceutical industry in the return they get on their investment. According to Fortune 500, if you pull the food companies out of all other manufacturing and processing and compare it back to that group, they make about a 50% greater return than do the rest. Hey, but let's not knock that, folks. Let's not knock that. Let's be careful about that, because that provides for us some opportunities for changes. What we really need to do is figure out how the producers can be a part of that 20%. One of the things I listened to John and I listened to what's happening in terms of the whole global market is, will the farmers and ranchers get any more of that money that travels globally? And when you figure that the three big firms here that slaughter 80+% of our beef have at least that much, I guess, up in Canada now. In '94, when IBP bought the Lakeside, they and Cargill had 70% of the slaughter in Canada, and they both increased in size, and of course ConAgra's into it in a big way now. Remember also, ConAgra and Cargill, and then if you put Mitsubishi with it, the largest bank in the world, are the biggest producers, or the slaughtering facilities in Australia. They're not quite as concentrated as what we are in this country, and they're in other countries of the world. Remember, it's these firms, and three firms ship 85% or more of the grain in the world. By and large, the question is, who's going to get the profit that goes into that? So there may be more volume. The question is, who gets the profit? Now, I want to close by simply saying this. Where is the light at the end of the tunnel? Number one is there are lots of groups that have major problems with the food system as it is now going together. Well, I can't find my overhead on that one, so I guess we'll start. Let me just tell you, there are welfare, or there are church groups who are concerned about the social justice issues. There are environmentalists. There are the organized labor. There's animal welfare people. There's just a whole host of people out there, and then the consumers themselves that are raising questions. As we watch what's happening on the horizon, did you stop to think that in the last political election, Ralph Nader, Ross Perot, wherever he fits on the political spectrum, and Pat Buchanan all took an anti-NAFTA and GATT position? That's not left or right anymore. That's across the spectrum. There's a new group that met 2 or 3 weeks ago called the Alliance Group. They're also coming in on the same position. You realize that 51% of the people did not vote in the last election? 8% went for Ross Perot. There were several people, according to exit interviews, that voted for either Dole or Clinton, but not with any enthusiasm. Folks, I would argue that anti-NAFTA and anti-GAFTA issue, along with the whole campaign financing issue, is really becoming focused more on an anti-corporate attitude. And you watch that thing move. I've been to a few meetings that just scare the heck out of me in terms of this anti-corporate business. And I don't know what it all means. But the campaign financing, all of that sort of gets tied back into that. And I think it's interesting to watch across the whole political spectrum the very issues I'm talking about, and the social consequences of that and the economic consequences of this are getting a lot of attention. I think there's some real potential for change. We get to come back on this afternoon. I think it's time we be eating food rather than talking about it now, but get to come back on this afternoon. And I want to talk about a couple of those kinds of things, a couple of the opportunities. So again, I say, yeah, realize where that money is. Let's not openly get too hard on it. Let's talk about how we can get part of that 20%. Most of you wouldn't know what to do with it if you got 20% return on your investment anyway.